A loyal wolf visited its injured owner, then it noticed something that stopped the doctor. The Montana wilderness was John's sanctuary. The rugged landscape, the towering pines, the crisp mountain air, it was where he felt most alive. He'd come here years ago, seeking solitude, a break from the noise and chaos of the city. He found it in a small, secluded cabin nestled deep within the forest, miles away from civilization. John was a wildlife photographer and researcher, dedicating his life to studying wolves. He was fascinated by their intelligence, their loyalty, their complex social structures. He spent countless hours tracking them through the wilderness, observing their behavior, capturing their beauty through his camera lens. One wolf, in particular, held a special place in John's heart. He called him Shadow. John had found him as a pup, abandoned and injured, left for dead. He'd nursed him back to health, raised him, and released him back into the wild. But Shadow never truly left. He became John's companion, a silent guardian, a loyal friend. Their bond was unique, a connection forged through mutual respect and understanding. John didn't try to tame Shadow, to make him a pet. He simply provided him with food, shelter, and companionship. In return, Shadow offered his loyalty, his protection, his unwavering presence. They lived a simple life, John and Shadow, their days filled with the rhythm of the wilderness. They hiked through the forests, explored hidden valleys, and camped under the stars. They shared meals, stories, and the quiet companionship that only two souls connected by a deep bond could understand. John was a man of few words, but his eyes spoke volumes. They were kind, intelligent, and filled with a deep love for nature. He was tall and lean, his body hardened by years of living in the wilderness. His face was weathered, his skin tanned by the sun, his hair streaked with gray. Shadow was a magnificent creature, a large gray wolf with piercing blue eyes. He was intelligent, loyal, and fiercely protective of John. He was John's shadow, always by his side, a silent guardian, a true friend. Their life was idyllic, a harmonious existence in the heart of the wilderness. They were content, happy, their bond unbreakable. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. Their peaceful existence was about to be shattered, their bond tested in ways they could never have imagined. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the forest floor as John set out on his usual trek. Shadow trotted silently by his side, his senses alert, his blue eyes scanning the surroundings. John was tracking a pack of wolves he'd been studying for months, observing their movements, their interactions, their intricate social dynamics. He was so focused on the tracks, on the subtle signs left behind by the wolves, that he didn't see the fallen log hidden beneath the thick layer of leaves. His foot caught on the log, sending him tumbling forward, his body crashing against the hard ground. He lay there for a moment, stunned, his breath knocked out of him. He tried to get up, but a sharp pain shot through his leg, making him groan. He knew immediately that something was seriously wrong. He tried to move his leg, but it was no use. The pain was excruciating, and he could feel the swelling starting to rise. He must have broken it, he thought grimly. He reached for his satellite phone, the lifeline that connected him to the outside world, but it was gone. It must have fallen out of his pocket during the fall. He was alone, injured, and without any means of communication. Panic started to set in. He knew he had to get help, but he couldn't move. The sun was starting to set, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. He was miles away from his cabin, with no one to turn to. Shadow whined softly, nudging John's face with his nose. He seemed to sense that something was wrong. John reached out and stroked Shadow's fur, finding comfort in his presence. "It's okay, boy," he said, his voice weak. "I'll be all right." But he knew he wasn't all right. He was in serious trouble. He needed help, and he needed it soon. He tried to stay calm, to think rationally. He knew he had to stay warm, to avoid hypothermia. He had to stay hydrated, to conserve his energy. He had to wait for help. But as the night fell, and the temperature plummeted, he started to lose hope. He was alone, injured, and the wilderness was closing in around him, its silence broken only by the howling of distant wolves. He closed his eyes, his mind filled with fear and despair. He thought of Shadow, his loyal companion, his only friend. He hoped that Shadow would be able to find his way back to the cabin, that he would be safe. He didn't know if he would survive the night. He didn't know if anyone would find him. He didn't know if he would ever see Shadow again. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his body numb with cold, his mind filled with darkness. He was lost, alone, and at the mercy of the wilderness. The cold seeped into John's bones, numbing his senses, blurring his thoughts. He shivered uncontrollably, his body trembling with cold. He knew he was losing consciousness, that he couldn't stay awake much longer. He closed his eyes, his mind drifting back to his childhood, to the warmth of his mother's embrace, the sound of his father's laughter. He remembered the day he found Shadow, a tiny, whimpering pup, abandoned and alone. He had taken him home, nursed him back to health, given him a second chance. Now, it was Shadow's turn to save him. Shadow, sensing John's distress, stayed by his side, his body pressed against John's, providing what little warmth he could. He whined softly, nudging John's face with his nose, trying to rouse him. He knew John was in danger, that he needed help. But he also knew that John couldn't move, that he was trapped. He had to do something. He had to find help. He looked around, his blue eyes scanning the surroundings. The forest was dark, the trees casting long, menacing shadows. He could hear the sounds of the night, the rustling of leaves, the hooting of owls, the distant howl of a wolf pack. He knew he had to leave, to go find help. But he didn't want to leave John alone, vulnerable, at the mercy of the wilderness. He hesitated, his mind torn between his loyalty to John and his instinct to seek help. He whined again, his voice filled with worry. Then, he made a decision. He would leave, but he would come back. He would find help, and he would bring it back to John. He nudged John one last time, then turned and ran into the darkness, his senses alert, his mind focused on his mission. He ran through the forest, his paws barely touching the ground, his body moving with a speed and agility that belied his size. He navigated the maze of trees and rocks, his senses guiding him through the darkness. He could smell the scent of humans, the faint aroma of smoke in the distance. He knew he was getting closer to civilization, to help. He ran faster, his heart pounding in his chest, his mind filled with hope. He wouldn't give up, he wouldn't stop until he found help, until he brought it back to John. He was Shadow, John's loyal companion, his silent guardian, his true friend, and he wouldn't let him down. Shadow ran through the dense forest, his powerful legs carrying him swiftly and silently. The terrain was rough, the undergrowth thick, but he never faltered. His senses were on high alert, his nose twitching, his ears perked, searching for any sign of human presence. He followed the faint scent of smoke, the telltale sign of a human settlement. He knew he was getting closer, that help was within reach. The forest began to thin, the trees giving way to open fields. He could see lights in the distance, the glimmering glow of a small town. He picked up his pace, his heart pounding with hope. He reached the outskirts of the town, a cluster of houses nestled beside a winding road. He approached cautiously, wary of humans, remembering the times he had been chased away, pelted with rocks, his presence and welcome. He stayed in the shadows, observing the houses, searching for any sign of life. He spotted a light on in one of the houses, a small cottage with a porch swing and a friendly-looking dog barking playfully in the yard. He hesitated, unsure of how to approach. He had never interacted with humans before, except for John. He didn't know if they would understand him, if they would help him. But he had no choice. He had to try. John's life depended on it. He took a deep breath and stepped out of the shadows, his body tense, his senses on high alert. He walked towards the cottage, his eyes fixed on the light, his heart pounding in his chest. The dog in the yard saw him and started to bark, its tail wagging excitedly. A woman came out of the house, her face curious. Shadow stopped a few feet away, his body still tense, his eyes pleading. He whined softly, trying to communicate, trying to convey the urgency of the situation. The woman looked at him, her eyes widening in surprise. She had never seen a wolf so close before. She was hesitant, unsure of what to do. Shadow took a step closer, his eyes fixed on hers, his tail wagging tentatively. He whined again, his voice more urgent this time. The woman seemed to understand. She looked at him, her eyes filled with concern. She could see the desperation in his eyes, the urgency of his plea. She took a step closer, her hand outstretched. "It's okay," she said softly. "I won't hurt you." Shadow hesitated for a moment, then took a step closer, his body relaxing slightly. He whined softly, his tail wagging more confidently. The woman smiled, her eyes filled with kindness. She seemed to understand. She knew he needed help. "Come on," she said, her voice gentle. "Let's go inside." Shadow followed her into the cottage, his heart filled with hope. He had found help. He had found someone who understood. He knew John would be okay now. He had done his job. He had saved his life. The woman, whose name was Sarah, led Shadow into her cozy cottage. She offered him water and a bowl of dog food, which he devoured gratefully. Sarah could see the urgency in his eyes, the way he kept pacing back and forth, whining softly. She knew he was trying to tell her something. "What is it, boy?" she asked gently, kneeling beside him. "What do you need?" Shadow whined again, then turned and walked towards the door, looking back at Sarah as if urging her to follow. Sarah understood. He was leading her somewhere. She grabbed her coat and followed Shadow out of the cottage. He led her through the town, past houses and shops, until they reached the edge of the forest. Then, he plunged into the trees, his senses guiding him through the darkness. Sarah struggled to keep up, her heart pounding in her chest. She trusted Shadow. She knew he was taking her somewhere important. After what seemed like an eternity, they reached a clearing. Sarah gasped. Lying on the ground, his body covered in snow, was John. He was unconscious, his face pale, his breathing shallow. Sarah rushed to his side, her heart breaking at the sight of him. "John," she cried, shaking him gently. "John, can you hear me?" John didn't respond. Sarah checked his pulse, her hand trembling. It was weak, barely there. She knew he was in critical condition. She looked at Shadow, who was watching her with worried eyes. "We need to get him help," she said, her voice urgent. "We need to get him to a hospital." Sarah pulled out her cell phone, but there was no signal. They were too far from town. She looked around frantically, searching for any sign of civilization. Then, she heard the sound of a helicopter in the distance. She looked up and saw a rescue helicopter flying towards them. She waved her arms frantically, hoping they would see her. The helicopter spotted her and landed in the clearing. Paramedics rushed out and examined John. They quickly stabilized him and loaded him onto the helicopter. Sarah climbed on board, refusing to leave John's side. Shadow followed, his tail wagging excitedly. He knew they were safe now. As the helicopter took off, Sarah looked back at the forest, her heart filled with gratitude for Shadow. He had saved John's life. He was a true hero. The helicopter landed at the nearest hospital, a small but well-equipped facility nestled in the foothills of the mountains. John was rushed into the emergency room, where a team of doctors and nurses were waiting. Sarah and Shadow followed closely behind, their hearts pounding with anxiety. Dr. Michael Evans, a seasoned physician with years of experience, took charge of John's case. He examined him thoroughly, noting the severity of his injuries. His leg was broken in multiple places, and he had suffered a concussion from the fall. He was also severely dehydrated and hypothermic. Dr. Evans ordered a series of tests, including x-rays and blood work. He wanted to get a complete picture of John's condition before proceeding with treatment. As the nurses prepared John for surgery, Dr. Evans noticed something unusual. A small, almost imperceptible mark on John's chest, just below his collarbone. It looked like a scar, but it wasn't like anything he had ever seen before. He examined it closely, his brow furrowed. It was a series of symbols, intricately woven together. He recognized some of them, ancient symbols used by indigenous tribes in the region. But others were unfamiliar, their meaning lost to time. He wondered how John had gotten this mark, how long he had had it. It looked old, but it was still raised, as if it had been recently aggravated. He decided to ask John about it, but he was unconscious, his body prepped for surgery. He would have to wait until he woke up. The surgery was successful, John's leg was repaired, and he was moved to the intensive care unit for observation. Sarah and Shadow stayed by his side, their presence a constant source of comfort. Dr. Evans returned to his office, his mind preoccupied with the strange mark on John's chest. He consulted his medical textbooks, searching for any information about it. He even contacted a historian, an expert in indigenous cultures, hoping to decipher the symbols. But no one could explain it. The mark remained a mystery. Dr. Evans realized that it was more than just a scar. It was a clue, a piece of a puzzle that he couldn't yet solve. He had a feeling that it was connected to John's condition, that it held the key to his recovery. He decided to wait until John woke up, hoping he could shed some light on the mystery. He had a feeling that the answer was close, that it was hidden somewhere in John's past. He knew that Shadow, John's loyal wolf, had played a crucial role in his rescue. He wondered if he also held the key to this new mystery, if he knew something that the humans didn't. He had a feeling that this was just the beginning of a long and complicated journey, a journey that would reveal secrets, uncover hidden truths, and ultimately save John's life. John remained in the hospital for several days, his body slowly recovering from the trauma. Sarah and Shadow were constant visitors, their presence a source of comfort and strength. Sarah would read to him, tell him stories about the town, about the people who were eagerly awaiting his return. Shadow would lie quietly by his side, his head resting on John's lap, his eyes filled with unwavering loyalty. Dr. Evans visited John every day, monitoring his progress, observing his reactions. He was fascinated by the bond between John and Shadow, the way they communicated without words, the deep understanding that existed between them. He had never witnessed such a connection before, and it made him question his own understanding of the human-animal relationship. As John's physical wounds healed, Dr. Evans noticed a change in his demeanor. He was more relaxed, more at peace. The fear and anxiety that had haunted his eyes were gone, replaced by a sense of calm and acceptance. He seemed to have made peace with his past, with the solitude he had chosen, with the dangers of the wilderness. Dr. Evans realized that John's healing was not just physical, it was emotional as well. He had faced death, he had been rescued by his loyal companion, and he had discovered a new appreciation for life, for the beauty of nature, for the importance of human connection. One sunny afternoon, John was finally discharged from the hospital. Sarah and Shadow were there to greet him, their faces beaming with joy. They helped him into the car, their hearts filled with gratitude. As they drove back to the cabin, John looked out the window, his eyes scanning the familiar landscape. He felt a sense of homecoming, a return to the place where he belonged. He had faced death in the wilderness, but he had also found life there, in the love of his loyal wolf, in the kindness of strangers, in the beauty of the natural world. They reached the cabin, nestled among the trees, its chimney puffing smoke into the crisp mountain air. It was a simple structure, but it was filled with memories, with love, with the promise of a new beginning. John stepped out of the car, his legs still slightly weak, but his spirit strong. He looked at Shadow, who was waiting patiently by his side, his tail wagging excitedly. He knelt down and embraced him, his heart overflowing with love. "Thank you, boy," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "You saved my life." Shadow licked his face, his eyes filled with unwavering loyalty. He didn't need words. He knew their bond was unbreakable, that their love would endure. They walked into the cabin, their hearts filled with peace. They were home. Life at the cabin resumed its familiar rhythm, but with a newfound appreciation for the simple joys. John, though still recovering, was back in his element. He spent his days exploring the wilderness with Shadow, capturing its beauty through his camera lens. He wrote about his experiences, sharing his insights about wolves and the delicate balance of nature. His work gained recognition, and he became a voice for conservation, advocating for the protection of these magnificent creatures and their habitat. The incident in the wilderness had changed John. He was no longer the solitary, reclusive man he once was. He had learned the importance of human connection, the value of community. He stayed in touch with Sarah, grateful for her help and her friendship. He even started visiting the town regularly, sharing stories of his adventures, connecting with the people who had helped save his life. The mystery of the mark on his chest remained, but it no longer haunted him. Dr. Evans, after extensive research, had discovered that it was an ancient symbol, a mark of protection, a symbol of a deep connection to nature. It was a fitting mark for John, a man who had dedicated his life to understanding and protecting the wilderness. One crisp autumn day, John and Shadow were hiking in the mountains, following the tracks of a wolf pack. They came to a clearing, a breathtaking vista overlooking a vast valley. John stopped, his heart filled with awe. He looked at Shadow, who was standing beside him, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. He knew that Shadow understood, that he shared his appreciation for the beauty of the wilderness. They sat down on a rock, the silence broken only by the rustling of leaves and the chirping of birds. They were content, at peace, their bond stronger than ever. John reached out and stroked Shadow's fur, his heart overflowing with love and gratitude. He knew that he owed his life to this loyal wolf, this magnificent creature who had risked everything to save him. "Thank you, boy," he whispered, his voice filled with emotion. "You're more than just a companion. You're my family." Shadow nudged his head against John's hand, his eyes filled with unwavering loyalty. He didn't need words. He knew their bond was unbreakable, that their love would endure. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the valley, John and Shadow walked back to their cabin, their hearts filled with peace and contentment. They had faced death in the wilderness, but they had also found life there, in the love of a loyal wolf, in the kindness of strangers, in the beauty of the natural world. They had learned that life was a gift, a precious gift to be cherished, a gift to be shared with those we love. And they were grateful for every moment, every memory, every beat of their hearts, every breath they took. They were John and Shadow, a man and his wolf, their lives intertwined, their bond unbreakable, their future shared. They were home, in the heart of the wilderness, where they belonged.